Alright, ladies and gentlemen, in this video we're going to discuss some of the specifics about the way that evolution happens and some of the details that surround the ways that we describe it. So we're going to start this by talking about the kind of evolution that you're probably used to and the stuff that we've been discussing when we talk about natural selection. And that's what we call divergent evolution. And that's when evolutionary change takes an organism, like Darwin's finches right here, and due to random variation and differing environments, this organism diverges into a entirely different selection of organisms. In this case, it's the different beaks that are adapted to the environments of the food sources on the islands. And this one we call adaptive radiation because the variations radiate out from a central concept. But divergent evolution can also be seen in one of the basic tenets of evolutionary theory, which is the whole idea of homologous structures, which we talked about in our evidence video. But the homologous structures that you see here, the pieces of the arm in a human, a horse, a cat, a bat, the bird, and the whale, well, all of these arose from a primitive organism that changed in very diverse ways and became divergent around an original ancestor. And so mostly what you think about when you think about evolution is divergent evolution, where organisms change and those changes add up and then they diverge to other forms of the organism or they diverge into different organisms. And that's generally the scope of how you think about evolution. But one interesting type of evolution is something called convergent evolution. And that's where the changes actually end up converging or coming together into a similar but not identical form. So for instance, all organisms started out as some sort of primitive fish-like creature. Okay, well, this fish-like creature diversified. It went through natural selection and evolution, and it ended up becoming a very, similar ancestor to the modern shark. Well, this fish also eventually diverged into the land reptile. Okay, now a lot of these land reptiles became the creatures that we know as dinosaurs. Well, we think about dinosaurs as being land creatures. Well, interestingly enough, some of these dinosaurs were actually sea dinosaurs. But it's a common misconception that these evolved from fish. Sea dinosaurs, which are different than fish, actually would have evolved from land reptiles just like the normal dinosaurs. And so that's what you see here. So what you see is two different creatures, shark and the ichthyosaur, who evolve similar structures, because, things that swim in the ocean have certain similarities, like fins, gills, that kind of stuff. But they didn't evolve from each other. Like the ichthyosaur does not have a common ancestor with the shark, or it does, but its more recent common ancestor is actually a land reptile. And we can actually see a very similar thing here when we go to a land mammal, because this land mammal right here actually has evolved from a land reptile. All right, all mammals did. But some of these land mammals actually evolved into cetaceans, porpoises, dolphins, whales. And again, these organisms have certain similarities to these other seafaring creatures. But they have some very distinct differences because they didn't evolve from a recent common ancestor, but instead they evolved down a long path. So they actually came from an ancestor that doesn't seem like it would make sense. And that's what convergent evolution is. It's when organisms that are not similar evolve into something that is similar. Okay? Next up on our hit parade, we've got coevolution, or what we sometimes refer to as the evolutionary arms race. Now, the evolutionary arms race is when the evolution of organisms is driven by other organisms in an environment. Now, we've seen this when we talked about animal relationships, things like mutualism and predator-prey and parasitism. Okay. Now, sometimes there's some other not or some other more interesting examples, like take a look at the structure of the beak of this bird, okay? And then take a look at the structure of the flower that bird gets nectar out of. That didn't happen by accident. The structure of the flower consistently evolved and changed over time. And the structure of the bird's beak consistently evolved and changed over time so it would still be able to eat out of the flower. The structure of the flower created the pressure to change the structure of the bird's beak. A similar thing happens with your immune system. Viruses and bacteria are constantly mutating and developing new biochemical ways to attack your cells. So the immune system in human beings and other land mammals and complicated organisms for that matter is known to be hypervariability, which means that they're constantly changing at a rate faster than the rest of your DNA. And that's an adaptation to help you deal with those things. And so it's very important to understand that these relationships that we talked about in the environment actually do have a distinct and sometimes direct influence on the way that other organisms evolve. Okay? That's coevolution. So next up, we have a really key idea here. All right, evolution is about your organism's genetics changing, and one of the terms that we use for genetics is called alleles. And so we have a lot of ways to connect natural selection and diversifying evolution and converging evolution and all of the things we're about to discuss as well to your genes. And so one of the big ways we do that is something called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Now, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is actually a mathematical equation that shows as a decimal or a percentage the frequency of certain gene combinations. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to discuss it as a way to connect evolution to your alleles or to your genes, so that way we could talk about how the pressure causes changes to those genes. Hardy-Weinberg hardly ever exists in nature. All right. What it is it's a useful model for us to discuss how pressures from nature are affecting an organism's genes. Okay. And one of the reasons it doesn't happen in nature is because it requires 5 specific things for it to happen. First off, there can be no selection. All right. So that means that there can be no pressure on a system. There can be no mutation, and we know that these two things never happen. So that's right off the bat. I mean, can be isolated situations for short time periods where you might see that, but overall, in the grand scheme of life on Earth, we know that those two things don't happen. Now, another necessary condition is no migration. So organisms have to be sort of geographically separated from themselves for Hardy-Weinberg to apply. You also need a population over a certain size. If the population is too small, the equation won't work. And then the last thing is there has to be random mating. And that's a big thing because one of the selections that we're going to discuss later on is known as sexual selection. And sexual selection is this concept that drives the fact that mating is not random. For organisms that sexually reproduce, mating is actually a type of selection that drives changes in genes. So these 5 assumptions that are required for us to interact with Hardy-Weinberg, they're not situations that ever really happen. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about how evolution actually affects your genes, what we want to do is we want to talk about how the effects on those genes can create different selection types. Okay, so I've got these 3 graphs here, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. Not that there's a lot of detail, but you'll see that these graphs each have a number right here, and that number corresponds to a certain type of selection. So the first one we're going to discuss is called disruptive selection. So you can see the red line here. This is the frequency of the various types of this sand dollar-like organism, or clam, whichever it is. Okay. And you can see that there are organisms down here at the extremes that aren't very common. And there are organisms here in the middle that tend to be sort of more combination of them that are more common. And what you'll notice is that when disruptive selection happens, it takes this most common version and basically, for some reason, makes it very bad in terms of survival. And so what happens is the organisms who have a variation at the extreme, like this one or this one, suddenly become more common. And the organism that was at the middle becomes less common. Okay? So what this is, when you have disruptive selection, the environment is selecting versions of an organism that are rare at the extremes. Okay? This actually is one of the ways that you see speciation happen most often. The farther apart the organisms are in their similarities, the more likely they are to become two different organisms over time. Now over here at number 2, we have what is called stabilizing selection. So what you see here is the similar red line, okay, where you have a sort of normalized distribution. But what happens here is that the environment is actually putting pressure on the edges and making the organisms at the extreme less viable in the environment. And so what this does is this creates a selection around the middle where that organism is so well adapted that it pushes all of the other organisms toward that. And this is actually something that we call stabilizing selection. And you actually tend to see this more often after organisms diversify. And they get a whole lot of variety. You see this nature sort of pulling them toward one version that came about that seems to be better than the others. Now, stabilizing selection doesn't eliminate all of the varieties, but it does make those at the extremes far less common. Now, finally, down here we have what's called directional selection. All right, so this one is directional. Now, directional selection is another way that species become extinct, and another way that species can sort of change over time. Basically, directional selection is what it sounds like. So here you have a situation where the red is the original line, okay? And so you have this situation where there was this little, llama-like animal that was short. And there were a couple of them that were medium, and very rare was the large. Well, something happens in nature. A good example of this is the evolution of the giraffe. Something happened in nature, and in that case, it was short trees died off, and long trees became common. And so the organisms at this extreme of the red line suddenly had a distinct advantage because they could reach more food. And so what you see over time is this blue line develop, where the short organism, which can no longer reach the food, starts to become less and less common. And the tall organism, which can now eat the food, starts to become more and more common. And this is called directional selection because nature and the environment is pushing an organism toward one of its options. And one of those options tend to be toward the extreme, not one that is a combination of many traits. All right? So we have 3 types of selection. We have disruptive selection, stabilizing selection, and directional selection. And I believe that will be it for this particular video.